Germany had been rearming for 6 years. In 1939, that economic model was technically bankrupt. Without war, the Reich would have collapsed due to its own debt in less than 2 years. Hitler knew it. His generals did too. Hjalmar Schacht, the financial architect of rearmament, had resigned in January 1939 after warning that the money supply had grown more in 10 months than in the previous 5 years. Hitler's response was to fire him. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed just 9 days before the first shot, had eliminated the only real strategic obstacle. Chamberlain had handed over the Sudetenland, convinced he had bought peace. In Berlin, that concession was read as authorization to continue. What history books rarely expose with sufficient clarity is this: the war that began that dawn was not an act of irrational madness. It was the logical conclusion of 20 years of intertwined decisions, the treaty that humiliated a nation, the republic that could not sustain itself, the leader who turned resentment into a political program, and the economy of a regime that could only grow by expanding outward or implode from within. This documentary exposes the reasons why the Second World War had to begin in 1939. On June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles, 2 German delegates, Johannes Bell and Hermann Müller, advanced between a double line of Allied soldiers to sign the document that formally ended the First World War. The hall smelled of beeswax and the huddling humanity of hundreds of diplomats, journalists, and dignitaries. The windows reflected the gardens of Versailles with that geometric perfection that the French kings had designed to express the dominance of reason over nature. No detail of the setting was innocent. The hall chosen was the one where Bismarck had proclaimed the German Empire in January 1871 after the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. The parallelism was deliberate, intended to engrave in the consciousness of every German present the magnitude of the reversal of fortune. What Bell and Müller signed was not simply a diplomatic document, it was the architecture of the problem that would come later. The Treaty of Versailles contained several layers of superimposed punishment. The first was territorial. Germany lost Alsace and Lorraine to France, territories it had conquered in 1871 and which now returned to French hands along with its Saar coal basins, exploited by France for 15 years. It lost northern Schleswig to Denmark, following a plebiscite that reflected the genuine will of the local population. It lost vast regions in the east, Posen, most of West Prussia, and the Memel Corridor to the newly created Republic of Poland. The case of Danzig was the strangest. A city with a population of about 357,000 inhabitants, mostly German in language, culture, and sentiment, was turned into a free city under the supervision of the League of Nations, separated from Germany by the so-called Polish Corridor, a strip of territory between 30 and 90 kilometers wide that connected Poland to the Baltic Sea and which, in doing so, isolated East Prussia from the rest of German territory. The trains traveling from Berlin to Königsberg crossed foreign territory. Truck drivers paid tariffs at a border where before there had been none. For millions of Germans, the mere existence of the corridor was an open wound that bled silently with every school map that was published. The case of Austria was equally unsettling. The more than 6 million ethnic Germans of that country had proclaimed in November 1918, during the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, their desire to join the new German Republic, exercising exactly the principle of self-determination that President Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed as the foundation of the new international order. Article 80 of the treaty explicitly prohibited it. Austria could not join the Reich without the permission of the League of Nations. Self-determination, it seemed, was only applicable when it produced the results that the Allies desired. The second layer of punishment was military. The German army was limited to 100,000 men without tanks, without aviation, and without heavy artillery. The Rhineland, the industrial region west of the Rhine, was demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces for 15 years. The navy was reduced to a fraction of its former power. The 90 warships of the German High Seas Fleet were interned in the Scottish port of Scapa Flow, where on June 21, 1919, a week before the signing of the treaty, their own crews scuttled them to avoid delivery. It was a gesture of national pride that Germans would remember with admiration for decades. Military aviation was completely prohibited. The third layer was economic and symbolic at the same time. No concrete figure for reparations was fixed in 1919, which generated the anguish of uncertainty for years. The final figure was not established until 1921, 132 billion gold marks, distributed in different categories of obligations. But the principle was established in 1919 with Article 231, the famous War Guilt Clause, which declared Germany and its allies responsible for all the damages caused by the conflict. For the German government, which had negotiated the armistice based on Wilson's 14 points and expected a treaty of peace without victors, Article 231 was the ultimate betrayal. For the majority of ordinary German citizens, it was an official lie turned into international law. It was not just the text of the treaty that generated resentment. It was the ceremony of its imposition. The German delegates were summoned as defendants to a trial already concluded, not as negotiators. They were handed the finished document and given 15 days to present written objections, which the Allies considered and mostly rejected. When Brockdorff-Rantzau, head of the German delegation, read the German response without standing before President Wilson and Prime Ministers Clemenceau and Lloyd George, the gesture was interpreted as an unpardonable provocation. It was, in reality, the gesture of a man who understood that what was being asked of him was to accept not only a defeat but a humiliation, and who refused to do both on his knees. The role of the United States in all this process deserves a specific mention because it defines the context in which the next decade would develop. President Wilson had arrived in Paris in January 1919 as the most powerful statesman in the world. His 14 points had promised a peace without victors or vanquished, based on the self-determination of peoples and on a collective security system managed by the League of Nations. What the European allies did with those principles was to use them selectively: self-determination to dismantle the empires of the vanquished, but not to review the empires of the victors; the League to guarantee the resulting status quo, not to correct it equitably. Wilson accepted compromises that betrayed his own principles because he believed that the League of Nations would correct the errors of the treaty over time. When he returned to Washington, the Senate rejected U.S. membership in the League in November 1919 by 55 votes to 39, insufficient to reach the required two-thirds. The system that had been built to function with the United States as the ultimate guarantee was left without its centerpiece from day one. What makes the Treaty of Versailles historically peculiar is its structural contradiction. It was harsh enough to generate deep and lasting resentment, but soft enough to leave the fundamental structure of German power intact. Germany remained a united state. Its borders still enclosed the largest industrial population of continental Europe. Its coal and steel resources remained superior to those of any neighbor. With 65 million inhabitants compared to the 40 million of France, the only serious continental rival, Germany was structurally the largest power in Europe, independent of any temporary restriction. The economist John Maynard Keynes saw it clearly from the beginning. In his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in December 1919, he argued that reparations would ruin Germany and with it the entire European economy. Keynes was wrong on the economic details, as the economist Etienne Mantoux would later demonstrate. Germany could have paid if it had wanted to, as it had the necessary productive resources. But Keynes was right politically. The resentment generated would be incalculable. The perception of injustice mattered more than objective economic reality. Every German who experienced hardship in the 20s or 30s had a ready explanation at hand. The fault was Versailles. During the 20s, the reparations system functioned in a way that none of its designers had anticipated. The United States lent money to Germany through private investments. Germany paid reparations with that money to France and Great Britain. France and Great Britain paid their war debts to the United States with those reparations. It was a circular chain of paper that depended on U.S. banks continuing to lend. Twice, attempts were made to resolve the problem with more rational formulas, the Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929. When the Great Depression arrived that same year, the chain broke suddenly. In 1932, at the Lausanne Conference, reparations were cancelled almost in their entirety. The final result was paradoxical. Germany had ended up paying a fraction of what was originally agreed upon. It had borrowed in net terms more than it had paid. And yet, the narrative of the theft of Versailles had penetrated every corner of German society. There was no way to undo that political damage with economic figures. The numbers did not matter. The story mattered. Versailles did not create Nazism directly, but it created the conditions without which Nazism could not have taken root. The Weimar Republic was born without anyone asking for it. On November 9, 1918, the Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed it from a window of the Berlin Palace on impulse to win the race against Karl Liebknecht, who 2 hours later would proclaim his own Soviet Republic. No one in the Social Democratic leadership wanted that thus, at that moment, in that way. But the military had led the war to disaster and needed someone else to sign the armistice. Marshal Hindenburg and General Ludendorff transferred the responsibility of defeat to the civilian government they themselves had requested be formed. And from that maneuver was born the most destructive myth of the century. The Dolchstoß legende, the stab in the back. The idea that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield but betrayed from within by Jews, socialists and pacifists. The myth was historically false, but it was politically unstoppable. The constitution approved in August 1919 was in theory one of the most advanced in the world. In practice, it was a system fractured into dozens of parties, incapable of building stable majorities. Between 1919 and 1933, Germany had 20 different governments with an average duration of less than 8 months. Article 48, designed to preserve democracy in emergencies by allowing governance by presidential decree, would become the instrument of its destruction. The economy was where the Republic definitively lost its citizenship. The hyperinflation of 1923 took the German mark to 4.2 trillion per dollar in November of that year. Life savings evaporated in weeks. When Wall Street collapsed in 1929 and US loans were withdrawn, unemployment reached 6.1 million in 1932. The cities were filled with breadlines. Every German who experienced hardship had the same explanation at hand. The fault was Versailles, the traitors, the system. In that context, Hitler did not come to power through a coup. He was placed there in January 1933 by German conservatives led by Franz von Papen, who believed he could use and control him. Papen affirmed with perfect confidence that in 2 months he would have pushed him into a corner until he squeaked. In 18 months, Hitler had fused the presidency and the chancellery into the figure of the Führer, eliminated unions, parties and regional governments, and demanded a personal oath of loyalty to his person from the armed forces. The Weimar Republic ceased to exist. The system designed to protect individual freedom functioned perfectly as a launching pad for the most efficient tyranny Europe had ever known. The German economy recovered with a speed that astonished the world. Unemployment fell from 6.1 million to practically zero in less than 4 years. Highways crossed the Bavarian valleys, factories worked 3 shifts, and Berlin's shop windows were full again. For millions of Germans who had experienced the hyperinflation of 1923 and the mass unemployment of the Great Depression, the regime offered something that no previous government had achieved: simultaneous stability and prosperity. The secret was not rearmament, as was believed for decades. It was massive public spending on infrastructure, exchange controls, union suppression to maintain stable wages, and above all the financial ingenuity of Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht built the rearmament on bills of exchange issued by a shell company, the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, backed by Krupp, Siemens and Rheinmetall, with an initial capital of only 1 million marks. Armament contractors issued bills against that fictitious society. The banks discounted them. The Reichsbank rediscovered them. The money reached the factories without appearing on any official balance sheet. According to Emil Pohl's testimony before the Nuremberg trials in November 1945, between 1934 and 1938, 12 billion Reichsmarks in these instruments were issued exclusively to finance rearmament. At their peak, they were equivalent to 6% of the German GDP, and the first bills issued in 1934 would expire in 1939, creating a deferred financial crisis that functioned like a countdown clock. In January 1939, Schacht delivered a devastating memorandum to Hitler. The money supply had grown more in 10 months than in the previous 5 years. Foreign exchange reserves were critically low, and there was no mechanism that could prevent a monetary collapse if spending continued. Hitler dismissed him summarily on January 20. Walter Funk took over the Reichsbank with instructions to eliminate any restriction on the creation of money. The Reich was trapped between two symmetric impossibilities. Continuing to spend meant inflation and collapse. Reducing spending meant unemployment and the end of the social consensus that sustained the regime. The only way out was expansion. Austria had contributed its gold reserves, Czechoslovakia its armament industry. Poland was to contribute its agricultural resources and its Silesian industry. Each conquest was, among other things, a financial rescue operation for the previous system. On February 3, 1933, 2 days after his first radio speech, Hitler spoke before the German military leadership in private. What he said there was radically different from what he had said in public. He took up the ideas of Mein Kampf, written in Landsberg prison in 1924, and of the Zweitsbuch, his 1928 manuscript never published for being too explicit. Germany was a nation with too much population for its available space. The only solution was the conquest of Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe, colonized by Germans after displacing or eliminating the existing populations. For Hitler, economy and ideology were inseparable. Germany's problem was not technical or temporary, it was existential, and it could only be solved with war. In the summer of 1936, Hitler personally drafted the memorandum of the 4-year plan. The army had to be ready for war in 4 years, the economy fit for war in the same time frame. He appointed Göring as plenipotentiary commissioner with powers to subordinate the entire economy to military objectives. The logic of the plan generated its own temporal pressures. Every synthetic gasoline factory built was an investment that only made sense if the war arrived on time. Every ton of artificial rubber produced by IG Farben in Leverkusen at a cost 4 times higher than Malayan natural rubber was a debt that could only be paid through the plundering of conquered territories. The economy of rearmament was structurally expansionist. To sustain itself, it needed to grow, and to grow, it needed territories. The army built between 1933 and 1939 was an instrument designed for quick and decisive blows, not for prolonged wars of attrition. It would be more useful in 1939 than in 1943, not because it was more powerful in absolute terms, but because the relative advantage over its adversaries would decrease with each passing year. In the summer of 1938, General Franz Holder and several officers seriously considered a coup d'état against Hitler if he led Germany into a war for which it was not prepared. They did not execute it because Munich proved Hitler was right and they were wrong. The democracies would yield without fighting. The clock kept ticking. The word appeasement would become synonymous with cowardice and nearsightedness. The reality was more complex. The policy had a coherent internal logic starting from premises that in 1933 or even in 1936 were not irrational. Germany had genuine grievances. The Polish corridor, Danzig, the prohibition of the Anschluss violated the principle of self-determination that Wilson himself had proclaimed. France had tried to isolate Germany with the occupation of the Ruhr in 1923, and the result had been hyperinflation and political radicalization. And above all, a new war would be catastrophic. Passchendaele, the Somme, Verdun, 600,000 casualties in 10 months of fighting for a city the size of a pinhead on the map. No one could justify repeating it. Neville Chamberlain was not the weak man that popular history has drawn. He was intelligent, tenacious, and genuinely convinced that he could achieve peace. What he could not see was that Hitler was not a politician with negotiable objectives. He was a gambler who only raised the stakes. The trap of appeasement was structural. Every concession was interpreted by Hitler not as good faith, but as proof of weakness, which encouraged him to demand more, which confirmed that resisting him from the beginning would have been better, which made it harder to resist the next demand without appearing inconsistent. It was a perfect system for producing exactly the result everyone wanted to avoid. Great Britain also had a real strategic excuse. In 1937 and 1938, its land army barely had 2 divisions prepared for combat in Europe. The Spitfire and the Hurricane were in production, but in insufficient numbers. The Navy simultaneously watched the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, with Japan threatening in the Far East. Not risking war in 1938 had logic. The problem was that this logic was used to avoid uncomfortable decisions instead of gaining real preparation time. France, for its part, had the largest army in Western Europe, but built exclusively for defense. The Maginot Line extended from the Swiss border to Longwy, but did not reach the English Channel. General Gamelin knew that the French army was incapable of a serious offensive against Germany. The ministers knew it, and no one said it out loud because admitting it would have meant admitting that their alliances with Poland and Czechoslovakia were dead letters. On March 7, 1936, Hitler ordered 3 battalions to cross the Rhine and enter the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, simultaneously violating the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Treaty that Germany had voluntarily signed in 1925. The officers carried written orders to withdraw immediately if they encountered French resistance. Hitler later admitted it in private. The 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking of my life. If the French had marched in, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. It was the wildest gamble he had made until that moment, and no one called his bluff. The French did not act. Gamelin estimated that expelling the Germans required general mobilization. General mobilization required political authorization. The government did not want to decide without the backing of Great Britain, and Great Britain considered that the Germans had a right to occupy their own territory. The circular reasoning closed in on itself. The Rhineland was remilitarized without anyone firing a shot. The consequences were enormous. Germany was able to build the Siegfried Line, making any French offensive toward the east incomparably more costly. Belgium, feeling unprotected, recovered its neutrality in the autumn of 1936, leaving open the gap on the northern French border that Manstein's armor would exploit in May 1940 by crossing the Ardennes. For Hitler, the lesson was more valuable than any conquered territory. He had gambled against the unanimous judgment of his generals, calculating from political psychology, not from the balance of forces, and he had won. From that moment on, the generals who warned him about military impossibilities were for him instruments of bureaucratic timidity. He applied that same logic in 1941 when he ignored the warnings about the Soviet Union. Only the Rhineland had turned out well. Russia did not. On February 12, 1938, the Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg arrived at Berchtesgaden for what he believed would be a negotiation. He found a 5-hour interrogation. Hitler opened it with a chain of accusations, while 3 generals, Reichenau, Keitel, and Sperl, remained silent in the room. Their presence needed no words. Schuschnigg, who had arrived with documents proving Nazi conspiracies inside Austria, never got to present them. He left having accepted the appointment of Arthur Seyss-Inquart as Interior Minister, the coordination of Austrian foreign policy with Berlin, and the decreeing of an amnesty for imprisoned Nazis. Hitler had gotten his way without moving a battalion. What came next was not planned. Schuschnigg, in a gesture of desperation, announced a plebiscite for March 13, with a question formulated to favor independence. Hitler, taken by surprise at the possibility that a free vote would block the Anschluss, reacted with the frantic improvisation that characterized his foreign policy. German forces received orders to prepare to cross the border in 48 hours. Göring coordinated Nazi pressure within Austria by telephone. and Ambassador von Papen was informed of his own dismissal at the moment the crisis entered an acute phase. The military operation from March 11 to 13 was a technical disaster and a political triumph. 70% of the motorized vehicles broke down en route. General Guderian described the armored advance as a museum of broken-down automobiles at the side of the road. However, the subsequent plebiscite recorded 99.7% support for incorporation into the Reich, a manipulated figure but one that also reflected a genuine popular enthusiasm that surprised even the German organizers. Mussolini, who in 1934 had mobilized troops at the Brenner Pass to deter exactly this operation, remained completely still. Europe formally protested and did nothing more. The lesson Hitler extracted from each success remained the same. Psychological calculation worked better than military calculation. Czechoslovakia was the most complex problem Hitler had faced because it was the most solid. It was a functional democracy, in fact, the only genuine democracy surviving in Central Europe in 1938, with a real army of 34 divisions reasonably well equipped. Its defensive positions in the Sudeten Mountains, which Czechoslovak engineers had built with the help of French technicians since 1935, formed a system of fortresses that the German generals themselves considered a serious obstacle. It had formal alliances with France, signed in January 1924 and renewed, and with the Soviet Union signed in May 1935. In purely military terms, the attack on Czechoslovakia in 1938 would have been the riskiest undertaking Germany had attempted. General Ludwig Beck, chief of the General Staff of the German Army, said it explicitly in a memorandum in May 1938. German forces were not in a position to execute Case Green, the attack on Czechoslovakia, without risking a strategic defeat. Beck resigned in August 1938 precisely because he could not accept the order to prepare that operation. It was the only formal resignation of a German general in protest against Hitler's policy. Hitler's solution was not military, it was political. The Sudetenland, 3.5 million ethnic Germans living in the border strip between Czechoslovakia and Germany, provided the vehicle. Their leader, Konrad Henlein, received precise instructions from March 1938, always demand more than the Czechoslovak government could grant. In his own words, recorded in a report to Hitler on March 28, 1938, "We must always demand so much that we can never be satisfied." The goal was not to obtain concessions. It was to demonstrate that Czechoslovakia was a non-viable state because it could not satisfy the demands of its largest minority. President Edvard Beneš had his own strategy. If he accepted all reasonable demands from the Sudetens and the Sudetens continued to reject the offer, it would be proven that the problem was not Czech injustice but German provocation, and then Great Britain and France would be obliged to back Czechoslovakia. It was a reasoning that had impeccable logic and a fatal flaw. It underestimated the Western determination to avoid war at any price that did not involve too visible a humiliation. On September 15, 1938, Chamberlain flew to Berchtesgaden to meet personally with Hitler. It was the first time in his life the British Prime Minister had boarded an airplane. He was 69 years old. Hitler told him that the Sudeten Germans must join the Reich and that any delay would produce a catastrophe. Chamberlain responded that in principle he did not oppose the separation of those territories provided the practical problems could be solved. Hitler, who had arrived ready to demand and to intimidate, found himself being offered in general terms what he wanted. He promised not to take military action while negotiations continued. Chamberlain returned to London convinced he had taken a great step toward peace. What he had taken was the first step of a surrender he did not recognize as such. The following weeks were a chain of concessions that accelerated. Great Britain and France jointly pressured the Czechoslovak government to accept ceding the territories with a German majority. When the Czechs protested, they were reminded that without British and French support, Czechoslovakia would be alone against Germany. When Beneš asked what would happen with the Soviet guarantee, they responded that the USSR would only act if France did so first, and France would only act if Great Britain did, and Great Britain would not. The isolation of Czechoslovakia was thus the work, to a large extent, of its own allies. On September 22, Chamberlain returned to see Hitler in Bad Godesberg. Hitler had raised the stakes. Now he wanted German troops to occupy the ceded territories immediately, before any formal transfer process. Chamberlain returned to London with the negotiation apparently broken. The Munich Conference of September 29 and 30, 1938, was formally convened at Mussolini's initiative, although the text of the agreement was largely prepared by the German Foreign Ministry and handed to the Duce to present as his own mediation initiative. Chamberlain, Daladier, Hitler and Mussolini met without Czech representatives and without Soviet representatives. The agreement they signed ceded the Sudetenland to Germany with a schedule of occupation in stages. It was objectively everything Hitler had asked for in Berchtesgaden, amplified by the humiliating factor that it was Czechoslovakia who had to accept it without having been consulted. The Czechoslovak representatives waited in a side room. They were informed of the conditions at 2 a.m. on September 30. Daladier received them with some shame. Chamberlain yawned and said he was tired, but pleasantly tired. The next day, Chamberlain requested an additional interview with Hitler and brought him a document he had prepared himself, a bilateral declaration that Germany and Great Britain would never again go to war with each other and that they would resolve their differences through the method of consultation. Hitler signed it with the same ease with which he signed everything else. It was paper and ink. Chamberlain waved the document as he stepped off the plane at Heston. "I have peace with honor," he said. And then, at Downing Street before the crowd, "I believe it is peace for our time." The relief of the people gathered there was genuine. The lesson of Munich was devastating for all participants, but in different ways. For Hitler, it was the confirmation that the Western statesmen were, in his own words, poor creatures, incapable of resisting pressure when the pressure was intense enough. For the German generals who had warned that Germany was not prepared for war, it was the demonstration that the Führer was right and they were wrong. War had not been necessary. For Stalin, it was proof that the Western democracies preferred to channel Nazi aggression eastward rather than face it directly. The exclusion of the USSR from the Munich Conference was the clearest signal that a European security system was being built that excluded it, and the only beneficiary of that exclusion was Germany. For the Czechs, who remained under German occupation starting from October 1938, the price was more immediate and more concrete. The Sudetenland included the armament industries of Skoda and Brno, the defensive positions in the mountains, and the strategic road network. Czechoslovakia, amputated of its natural defenses, was already an indefensible state. Munich was the death sentence of Czechoslovakia pronounced 6 months before the execution. On March 15, 1939, German troops entered Prague. Bohemia and Moravia became a protectorate of the Reich. Slovakia declared itself an independent state under German protection. President Emil Hácha, a 66-year-old man with heart problems, had been summoned to Berlin on March 14 and received by Hitler at 1 a.m. During the following hours, a combination of direct threats, the city would be bombed if he did not sign, and constant psychological pressure led him to a cardiac collapse. He was attended by Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, and then convinced to sign the formal surrender of the Czechoslovak state. Goering later recorded in his diary that the planes were grounded by fog and that the threat of bombing was a bluff. Hácha did not know it. This move was qualitatively different from all previous ones. Austria was a German population that wanted to join the Reich. The Sudetenland was Germans who wanted self-determination. Prague was the capital of a state with a majority Czech population, not German. Hitler had explicitly promised in Munich that the Sudetenland were his last territorial demands in Europe. 6 months later, he was occupying a country that no one could present as part of German living space. The reaction in London was immediate and visceral. Chamberlain delivered a speech on March 17 in Birmingham that marked the end of an era. He asked rhetorically if the occupation of Prague was the last attack on a small state or the first step toward world domination by force. He did not answer the question, but the fact of posing it publicly meant that the period of unrestricted appeasement had ended. On March 31, 1939, Chamberlain read a declaration in the House of Commons that would change the course of history. Great Britain and France guaranteed the independence of Poland. If Poland was attacked and decided to resist, both powers would support it with all the means at their disposal. It was the first time that Great Britain had committed in peacetime to defend an Eastern European state. The guarantee had contradictions that were obvious to any military analyst. Great Britain had no way to militarily defend Poland. Between the two countries there was no common border nor direct sea access. The only power capable of getting effective land forces to the Polish theatre of operations was the Soviet Union. And the guarantee did not include the USSR. Poland categorically rejected any form of military cooperation with the Soviets, whom they considered as threatening as the Germans themselves. The guarantee was, in practice, a diplomatic gamble, the hope that the prospect of war with Great Britain and France would deter Hitler from attacking. The strangest and most decisive piece on the entire board was the Soviet Union. Stalin had observed the events of 1938 and 1939 with a mixture of genuine alarm and cold calculation. Munich had confirmed his worst suspicions. The Western democracies had no intention of facing Hitler. They preferred to orient German aggression eastward toward the USSR. The exclusion of the Soviet Union from the Munich conference was the clearest signal of that purpose. If the objective had been collectively to defend the European order against aggression, the USSR was an interested party with an army of several dozen divisions. The decision not to invite it could only be read as the decision to build a European security system that excluded it. The negotiations between the Western powers and the USSR in the spring and summer of 1939 are one of the most frustrating chapters of 20th century diplomacy. The chronological record is devastating for Great Britain and France. The first Soviet proposal arrived on April 17, 2 days after the British made their initial approach. The Western response took 3 weeks. When the Soviets responded in days, the Westerners took weeks. When it was finally agreed to send military missions to Moscow to negotiate technical cooperation, the British delegation travelled by cargo ship, the city of Exeter, instead of by plane, spending almost a week on the journey. A claim about the absence of available planes that no one with access to the resources of the British Empire could make with a serious face. The composition of the military delegation sent to Moscow in August was equally revealing. The French one was led by General Dumont, an officer with rank and with instructions to reach an agreement as soon as possible. The British one was led by Admiral Drax, a man without plenipotentiary powers, which turned any negotiation into an exercise without binding consequences. The Soviets, who had sent Kliment Voroshilov himself, defense commissar and member of the Politburo, saw the difference immediately. The central question that Voroshilov posed to the military missions on August 14, 1939, was perfectly concrete. Could the Red Army cross Polish and Romanian territory to reach contact with the enemy in case of war with Germany? It was the question that any military planner would have identified as fundamental from the first day of the negotiations because the geography was obvious. The USSR had no direct border with Germany in 1939. To reach the Germans, the Soviets had to pass through Poland or through Romania. Without that access, any Soviet military commitment was purely rhetorical. The Western delegations had no answer because no one in London or Paris had asked for that answer from the Polish and Romanian governments before sending the missions to Moscow. The meeting adjourned without agreement. 3 days later, Voroshilov postponed the talks indefinitely. At that same moment, Joachim von Ribbentrop was flying to Moscow. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, shocked the world. The public text was a non-aggression pact for 10 years with clauses for mutual consultation and arbitration. But the secret protocol that accompanied it was the true content of the agreement. It divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, Finland and the eastern part of Poland would fall under the Soviet sphere. The western part of Poland would fall under the German sphere. It was the undisguised application of the principle of great power agreements that had governed European diplomacy before 1914, without any varnish of the collective principles that had supposedly replaced that system after 1919. For Hitler, the pact solved the fundamental strategic problem. With the USSR neutralized, he could attack Poland without the risk of a two-front war that had destroyed Germany in the First World War. Furthermore, he calculated that news of the pact would paralyze Great Britain and France. Without the prospect of the Red Army as a counterweight in the East, with what argument could they militarily defend Poland? For Stalin, the pact bought time. It recovered territories that the USSR had lost between 1917 and 1921, and it oriented the first clash with Germany toward the west, not toward the east. Both calculated that the other would respect the terms of the agreement longer than actually occurred. Hitler invaded the USSR on June 22, 1941, less than 2 years after the signing. The mutual faith of two leaders who had built their careers on the systematic breaking of their commitments was the darkest irony of the whole period. Danzig was the perfect excuse precisely because it was the most justified. The city was German in every practical sense. Its population of 357,000 inhabitants was overwhelmingly German-speaking. Its architecture, its culture, and its history linked it to the Reich with stronger ties than those of the Sudetenland or even those of Austria. It had been separated from Germany in 1919, not for national reasons, but for strategic ones. Poland needed access to the sea, and Danzig was the most important port on the Baltic coast at that latitude. Since then, the city lived in a political limbo of increasing tension. Its local administration had been controlled by the Nazis since 1933. The High Commissioner of the League of Nations formally maintained the special status of the city, but his authority was reduced every year. On October 24, 1938, barely 3 weeks after Munich, Ribbentrop presented the German demands on Danzig to Polish ambassador Józef Lipski for the first time in formal terms. The proposal had a logic that the Westerners themselves found difficult to refute. Danzig would return to the Reich, but Poland would retain full economic guarantees in the port. There would be an extraterritorial German highway and railway line through the Polish corridor, and in exchange, Germany would guarantee Polish borders for 25 years. It was, in essence, the same formula that had been applied in the Sudetenland, changing formal sovereignty for economic and security guarantees. The Polish foreign minister, Colonel Józef Beck, rejected the proposal. He continued to reject it in every subsequent reiteration. The Polish rejection was not irrational. Beck had observed what happened with the guarantees offered to Czechoslovakia. They evaporated in the first crisis. And he understood the mechanics of the process. Danzig was the first link in a chain that would end with the incorporation of Poland into the German sphere as a satellite state. The difference between an ally and a satellite was exactly the type of matter on which no compromise was possible. With the British guarantee of March 31, Danzig ceased to be a bilateral German-Polish matter. It became the point where the credibility of the entire Western guarantee system was at stake. If Great Britain and France allowed Hitler to get his way over Danzig after having given explicit guarantees to Poland, their word would be worth nothing in any future negotiation. If they resisted, they risked war. There was no way out without unacceptable cost. The summer of 1939 was a period of calculated paralysis in which all actors knew that the system was at the limit, but none could make the first move. Hitler expected the Westerners to force the Poles to yield as they had forced the Czechs. Beck expected Hitler finally to back down upon seeing Polish firmness. Great Britain expected that some negotiation formula that did not yet exist could be invented in time. France expected the British to find that formula. On August 22, 1939, Hitler gathered his most important generals in Berchtesgaden. He informed them that he had made the decision to attack Poland. The speech was not intended to inform, but to motivate and intimidate those who still had doubts. He told them that war was inevitable and that it was better now than later. He told them that the West would not intervene effectively. And then he uttered a sentence that reveals as much about his intentions as any military directive. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? It was the language of the visionary who knows the moment has come. It was also the language of the genocidist who anticipates impunity. On August 25, two events shook those calculations. Mussolini communicated that Italy was not in a condition to intervene militarily. The list of war materials he requested from Germany as a condition for his participation was, in the words of Count Galazzo Ciano, Italian foreign minister, enough to kill a bull if a bull could read. On the same day, Great Britain formalized its alliance with Poland through a mutual assistance treaty signed in London. Hitler, who had set the attack for 4:30 in the morning on August 26, ordered it stopped. The units that were already moving had to be halted at the last moment. At least one unit on the Slovak border did not receive the order in time and attacked before being stopped. A company of border guards under the command of Lieutenant Hennecker crossed the border and was sent back with casualties. It was an involuntary anticipation of the confusion that operating at the limit of deadlines produces. The following days were a frenzy of diplomatic activity that functioned at two simultaneous levels. At the official level, Ambassador Henderson transmitted proposals between Hitler and the London government. At the unofficial level, Göring used the Swedish mediator Birger Dalarus, a businessman with contacts in both capitals, as an alternative transmission belt. Hitler formulated a final offer that included the guarantee of the British Empire and the promise of an alliance with Great Britain once the Polish question was resolved. The British moved the German conditions to Warsaw, demanding that Poland send a plenipotentiary to Berlin. Beck categorically refused. At 12:40 on August 31, Hitler signed the final attack order. The false flag operation that preceded the attack was executed that same night. Franz Honiok, an agricultural machinery salesman arrested on August 30, was used as conserve in SS jargon, a body placed on the scene to simulate an enemy victim. On the night of August 31, he was drugged by an SS doctor, taken unconscious to the Gliwice radio station, and executed there while an SS commando simulated a Polish attack. The episode lasted 13 minutes. Other corpses from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp were abandoned at border points. It was the alibi fabricated for the invasion that would begin 5 hours later. At 4:45 in the morning on September 1, 1939, the guns of the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Westerplatte. Westerplatte was a promontory of sand and pines at the entrance to the port of Danzig, a strip of land about 600 meters wide and 1,800 long, in which Poland maintained a military ammunition depot, guarded by a garrison of 182 men under the command of Major Henryk Sukarski. Its defenses included concrete bunkers, 37mm anti-tank guns, and, to the surprise of German intelligence, two 76mm guns whose existence had not been detected. The artillery of the Schleswig-Holstein, with trajectories too flat to destroy the concrete bunkers, produced limited damage. The naval detachment that had landed from the ship penetrated the Polish lines but was repelled. A second attack at 9 in the morning, in which SS units under the command of SS Brigadeführer Eicke participated, likewise failed with losses of approximately 35% among dead and wounded in the first assaults. Cloud cover prevented air support until late in the afternoon, when 60 Stuka bombers attacked the Polish positions without appreciable results on the concrete bunkers. In the city of Danzig, the post office in Heveliusplatz offered a resistance that German propaganda had not anticipated. Its stone walls over a meter thick, reinforced with sandbags and armored shutters, turned it into an improvised fortress that resisted until late in the afternoon. A field gun opened a breach in the main entrance, but it was not until the firefighters pumped gasoline into the basements and set fire to the building that the 51 defenders were forced out. According to German military law, not being uniformed soldiers, their defense was declared illegal. The survivors were executed as Freischärler snipers after a court-martial held a month later. The memory of those 51 Polish postal employees who died defending a post office as if it were a fortress would define the character of the Polish resistance during the following years. Meanwhile, across the entire 1,800-kilometer line of the Polish-German border, the attack plans carefully prepared over the last 5 months went into execution. Army Group North, under the command of General Fedor von Bock, advanced from Pomerania and East Prussia to cut the Polish corridor and converge on Warsaw from the north. Army Group South, under the command of General Gerd von Rundstedt, advanced from Silesia and Slovakia toward the Polish capital from the south and southwest. The panzers of General Heinz Guderian crossed the Polish plains at speeds that the defenders could not anticipate. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, was not in 1939 the result of systematic doctrinal planning of decades. It was rather the combination of available technology, tanks, tactical support planes, and radio communications, with a willingness to take risks and a tactical flexibility that the more conservative armies of France and Great Britain would take years to match. The Luftwaffe dominated the air from the early hours. Polish cities began to burn. Multiple formations of bombers sought their targets in cities that had awakened without knowing it was the beginning of the most destructive war in the history of humanity. The first mass bombing of a civilian population of the Second World War did not fall on Warsaw or on Danzig, but on Wielun, a Polish city of 30,000 inhabitants without any significant military value. At 4:40 in the morning on September 1, 5 minutes even before the shot of the Schleswig-Holstein, 21 He-111 and Junkers Ju-87 Stuka bombers of Bomber Group 76 attacked the city center, the hospital, and the residential neighborhood. In the first hours, between 200 and 400 people died. The city was 75% destroyed. There were no military objectives. It was the rehearsal of a tactic that the Luftwaffe would perfect in Guernica, in Rotterdam, in Coventry. In August 1939, the pressures pushing toward war had reached a critical mass. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, and each reinforced the others. The economic pressure was real and urgent. The Reich functioned with a growing internal debt that, according to Schacht's own estimates before his resignation, was unsustainable beyond 2 or 3 years without an injection of external resources. By January 1939, when Schacht delivered his last warning memorandum to the Reichsbank, the German money supply had grown more in 10 months than in the previous 5 years. The structure of prices and wages had broken down. The quality of consumer goods was visibly deteriorating. No technical mechanism existed capable of preventing monetary collapse if spending continued to expand without limits. The strategic pressure derived from the rearmament schedule of the adversaries. In 1939, the Luftwaffe had approximately 4,000 first-line planes, compared to 3,100 for Great Britain and France combined. But the situation would reverse in 1940. The production of British Spitfires and Hurricanes would exceed German production that year. The Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 would demonstrate that the Luftwaffe did not have the superiority that everyone, including its own planners, had taken for granted. The margin was much narrower than calculated. In armor, Germany had a quantitative but not qualitative advantage. The French Matilda and British Churchill tanks were technically superior to the Panzer I and Panzer II that constituted the majority of the Wehrmacht's armored fleet in 1939. The German advantage was one of organization, doctrine, and tactical leadership, not hardware. That advantage was harder to quantify but also harder to replicate, and it would reduce as Western armies learned. Internal political pressure was less visible but equally real. Hitler needed continuous successes to maintain the consensus that was the base of his power. Each year that passed without a new dramatic achievement was another year of wear. Party factions, never completely unified, generated tensions that only the inertia of success could keep under control. The convergence of these pressures in the summer of 1939 created what historians call a critical juncture, a moment when the sum of all vectors points in the same direction and the inertia of the system becomes almost impossible to stop. The question of why it was 1939 and not 1938 or 1941 has a composite answer. In 1938, the German economy could still breathe with the resources of Austria and the Sudetenland. The Mefo-Wechsel would not expire until 1939. The Polish army had not been identified as a priority objective until March 1939. The USSR was still an unpredictable strategic factor. There was no element that forced action in 1938 with the urgency that 1939 would impose. In 1941, the situation would have deteriorated irreversibly. German reserves of fuel and raw materials were already at the limit in 1939, with stocks sufficient for barely a few weeks of intense combat. Great Britain was accelerating its rearmament with an energy that would double its production of combat planes in 1940. The tactical advantage of the Wehrmacht in organization and doctrine would reduce as its adversaries studied its methods. The Red Army, purified of its best generals by the purges of 1937 to 1938, was at its point of greatest weakness and recomposition. The window was open and it was closing. On August 31, 1939, Ambassador Lipski met with Ribbentrop at 6:30 in the evening at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The meeting lasted less than half an hour. Ribbentrop asked if Lipski had plenipotentiary powers to negotiate. Lipski responded that no, his mission was to inform that the Polish government was considering the British mediation proposals favorably. Ribbentrop did not communicate the German terms that were technically prepared, but which Hitler had ordered not to reveal under those conditions. There was no exchange of proposals, there was no negotiation, there was nothing. The only occasion in which the two countries discussed the Danzig crisis directly in the entire summer of 1939 ended in less than 30 minutes without anything relevant being said. When Lipski left the building, the attack plans for 4:45 in the morning were already operational. What happened between September 1 and 3, 1939, reveals the nature of the international system that produced the war. Great Britain and France had formal obligations toward Poland. Germany had attacked it. Logic indicated an immediate declaration of war. What happened was different and more revealing. France wanted to wait. The official reason was that the General Staff needed time to complete mobilization. The real reason was that the Foreign Minister, Georges Bonnet, continued searching for any way out that avoided war. Mussolini, repeating with extraordinary fidelity the role he had played in Munich, proposed a four-power conference for September 5, with the precondition that Danzig be ceded to Germany. It was the architecture of a second Munich proposed while German troops advanced toward Warsaw. Chamberlain appeared before the House of Commons on September 2, ready to explain why they were still negotiating. What he found was a parliamentary rebellion without precedent in modern British politics. The Conservatives, who had faithfully supported the government for years, were furious. Leo Amery, a veteran Conservative who had been Secretary of State for the Colonies, shouted at Arthur Greenwood, who represented the absent Labour leader Hugh Dalton, "Speak for England!" Greenwood spoke and said that if there were no German ultimatum the next day, the government's position would be untenable. The cabinet ministers themselves warned Chamberlain privately that the government would fall if he did not send the ultimatum before the next parliamentary session. The British ultimatum was delivered at 9 in the morning on September 3. Ambassador Henderson delivered it personally to State Secretary Weizsäcker. The deadline was 2 hours. At 11 in the morning, Chamberlain spoke to the nation by radio with a voice that his contemporaries would describe as that of a man who had aged 10 years in a week. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that, unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us from that hour. He paused. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. The French ultimatum was delivered at noon and expired at 5 in the afternoon. The general European war was a fact. Warsaw, which had been resisting since the dawn of September 1, was already burning. There is no single cause for the war breaking out in September 1939. There is a convergence of pressures that, added up, made that date the only one possible within the logic of each of the actors involved. From the German point of view, 1939 was the best moment within a temporal window that was closing irreversibly. Rearmament had reached a level sufficient to win short and decisive wars against individual adversaries. Great Britain and France were rearming faster than propaganda acknowledged. The German relative advantage would decrease with each passing year. The pact with the USSR eliminated the risk of a two-front war that had destroyed Germany in the First World War. The Reich's economy demanded new resources or would face an internal financial crisis that no juggling could resolve indefinitely. The Mephowechsel were beginning to expire in 1939, creating a deferred financial pressure that turned into fiscal urgency. The internal political dynamic demanded the maintenance of a chain of successes that inaction over Danzig could break. From the Western point of view, 1939 was the year in which the political price of appeasement definitively exceeded the price of war. The occupation of Prague destroyed the narrative that made each previous concession tolerable, that Hitler had legitimate national objectives that could be satisfied and that once satisfied the system would stabilize. After Prague, that narrative was unsustainable. Public opinion in Great Britain and France, which had applauded Munich with genuine relief, now demanded resistance with a firmness that governments could not ignore without losing power. From the Soviet point of view, 1939 was the year in which it became clear that the Western democracies had no intention of building a collective front that included the USSR on terms of real equality. The pact with Germany was the answer. If no one wanted to defend Soviet interests, Stalin would defend his own unilaterally, recovering lost territories and buying time before a confrontation he considered inevitable. From the Polish point of view, 1939 was the year in which the illusion of the intermediate position between Germany and the USSR became completely unsustainable. The history of Poland, with its repeated disappearances from the European map in the previous century, had taught a lesson that Beck had internalized perfectly. Yielding to pressure did not guarantee survival. Czechoslovakia had yielded in Munich and 6 months later had likewise disappeared. Resisting was the only position that preserved the dignity of the state, even if it did not guarantee its physical survival. That this calculation proved erroneous, that Polish survival was not the real objective of either Berlin or Moscow, does not change it as a calculation. It was rational within its own premises. There was also a deeper dimension connecting all these levels, the collapse of trust as the currency of international exchange. Since 1936, Hitler had repeatedly demonstrated that his promises were worth nothing beyond the moment they were convenient. He had remilitarized the Rhineland after promising to respect the treaties. He had absorbed Austria after promising to respect its independence. He had occupied Prague after promising in Munich that he had no more territorial demands. Each violation of a promise made the next less costly in terms of reputation because the reputation was already destroyed. And without the possibility of trusting promises, the only currency left was force. The Western democracies could offer concessions, but without the certainty that those concessions would produce lasting peace. What they offered was exactly the same as they had offered in each previous crisis, time before the next crisis. Hitler, who knew it, had only one argument to negotiate, the threat of force. The Poles, who also knew it, had only one argument to resist, the certainty that yielding would not help. The mechanism that set the war in motion was not only the malice of one man, nor only the cowardice of others. It was a system of states that had lost the capacity to communicate with honesty because each honest communication threatened a position that each considered essential for its political survival. The Treaty of Versailles had created a Germany resentful enough to want to reverse the European order, but strong enough to be able to try. The economic recovery under Nazism had given that resentment the material energy of a real army. Appeasement had fed Hitler's ambitions by repeatedly confirming that concessions were obtained through pressure, not through negotiation. The exclusion of the USSR from the collective security system had deprived that system of its only effective counterweight in the East. The guarantee to Poland had created an obligation that turned Danzig into the point where neither party could yield without unacceptable consequences. September 1, 1939 was not the day in which one will triumphed over the others. It was the day in which the mechanisms for peaceful resolution of conflict were exhausted simultaneously for all the actors involved. Each had reached its own limit for different reasons and with different chronologies, but all arrived at the same point at the same time. The question of why it was 1939 has an answer that is at once simple and profound, because that was the year in which the pressures accumulated over 2 decades simultaneously exceeded the capacity of all available systems to absorb them. Versailles had sown the seed. Weimar had fed it in fertile soil. Nazism had turned it into something capable of destroying the entire garden. Appeasement had watered that plant in the hope it would grow in the right direction, and the failure of Soviet negotiation had left the only firewall that could have contained the fire when it was already too late to put it out with words. The war that began on September 1, 1939, was not the war that almost none of its protagonists had wanted or foreseen. Hitler expected a diplomatic crisis that would be resolved without general combat, as had happened before. Great Britain and France expected the guarantee to Poland to deter without the need for being fulfilled. Stalin expected to stay on the sidelines while the capitalists destroyed each other. Beck expected that Polish firmness would keep Germany at bay indefinitely. None of them got what they sought. All contributed, each in their own way and with their own logics, to producing exactly the result they said they wanted to avoid. That is what makes 1939 not simply a date on the calendar, but the knot where 20 years of decisions taken, of decisions avoided, and of consequences that no one calculated correctly, converge until there was no longer a way to undo them. In the coming weeks, the Polish army would fight with a ferocity that would surprise its invaders. Westerplatte would resist 7 days. The riders of the Pomorska Cavalry Brigade would charge against German tanks with drawn sabers, not out of technological ignorance, but out of tactical desperation in the absence of anti-tank weapons. Warsaw would not be evacuated until September 27. And when it finally fell, the last defenders would remember the afternoon of September 1 with a precision that time would not erase. The first day in which the world understood that it had entered a war that would not end until it had consumed more than 60 million lives. The clock that had been set in motion in the Hall of Mirrors of Versailles in June 1919 finished its count on September 1, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, with the sound of the guns of the Schleswig-Holstein opening fire on Westerplatte.